Alright, so taking the carburetor off is a little more challenging than it used to be on the old days. What we had to end up doing is I wanted to slide the carburetor off of these studs, which is the traditional way to do this, but because of this 90-degree air horn, which is locked into this plastic shroud, it's not going to allow you to do that. So there's a couple different ways you could do it, but for the video's sake, I'm going to actually take this plastic shroud off just to be able to check in to the top of the motor and make sure nothing's been growing in there animal-wise. So in order to do that, there's a couple screws you have to take out. There's two in the rear of the block here. Those are 10mm, and they have the shroud slotted in like a horseshoe. That way you don't have to actually take the bolt all the way out. So that's kind of nice. So you have the two in the back there on either side, and then in the front, they threw a curveball and put a T45 Torx bit in there. Why, I don't know, but if you don't have a T45, you can just use a channel lock type of plier, because these really weren't that tight. They're only into aluminum. They're not super tightened down, so you only have to loosen them a couple turns just to get this to free off of there. And then the last piece is they decided that they needed to put the shroud fan cover on and lock it so that you couldn't take the shroud off without taking this off. So these are little 8mm kind of self-tapping style screws that you take off. So that comes off. You can see we already have had some guests in the engine over the many years that it's been sitting, which is something that you're going to deal with anytime you have a shed, or let alone this was sitting outside, so God knows. All right, so then we have that taken off with all four, the two and the two taken out. This shroud will lift off and out of the way, and you can see all of our guests have been plenty busy in here. I've seen them a lot worse, but certainly have had some activity. So we can see that they've chewed into the coil wire, and this is a bad situation if they've gotten into the actual rubber where it conducts the electricity. But we've lucked out here because they've only gotten into the fabric heat shroud. So that'll be okay. We can just take scissors and trim that clean, or if you can just leave it alone, it's not going to do anything. So we don't have to get into replacing the coil. We'll clean this all out with an air compressor to get it back, and scrub it a little bit if we want to get some of the residue off. So now we move on to the carburetor itself. We've taken off the two. They're 11mm hex nuts that hold this air horn on. So we'll take that off, set that aside. There's a rubber gasket in here. Just make sure that doesn't fall out. And if it does, it's okay. You just press it back into this groove. It's literally just a square-sided rubber O-ring. This hose was plugged into that. That's just a slip-on hose. It's a crankcase vent. They call it a PCV system, or crankcase breather. So that's just for emissions and to help the crankcase fumes get burned up in the actual carburetor. So, and I was talking about that fuel solenoid earlier. That has a plug on the bottom, which we just simply wiggled and pulled down. It can only go on one way because of the way this plug is shaped, so don't worry about that. So that connected into the bottom here, so we got that off. And now we're left with the throttle linkage. So you have two different rods here. One is going to control the actual speed of the engine. This is what they call the throttle butterfly. And then it has a little spring on it to return. The spring is really weak and chintzy and doesn't do a whole lot, but it's there, so you have to make sure you account for it. And then this other rod controls the choke. And what I've noticed is that this choke hasn't been used in so long that it's actually like frozen. It's really hard to move. And it has a spring built into its butterfly shaft, which I couldn't figure out how this operated at first, because it just has this rod that loops through a slotted bracket here, and it gets pushed by this tab. So when you operate the throttle control up here, you can see full throttle with the rabbit and then the choke position. So you would operate it here, and when you wanted to start the engine, you'd push it to the choke. And when you push it to the choke position, this is supposed to come up to push this rod and push this choke blade closed. But because it's so old and just seized up, we're gonna have to really work with some WD-40 and to clean that up. Because even if we did get this to actuate to push the choke closed, when you got the engine to run and moved it down to the throttle position, the choke would stick on and the motor would not run well at all. And what I've determined is that instead of having this connected to pull this back off, they're relying on these little internal spring wound in here that's supposed to back this off. So because it has so much stuff caked in here and into the aluminum and everything, we're really gonna have to work when we take this carburetor off to make sure that when we take these rods off, that this blade will close and just try and stay on its own without any help, because that's all that it's relying on is this rod to push it closed and then the spring itself to launch it back off. So instead of doing the traditional way of taking this carburetor off of these studs, what I decided to do is take it off at the head. I believe it has a little bit better quality seal in there that's going to be a lot easier for us to reuse. Anytime that you start taking pieces of this intake system, we'll call it, apart, anything before this throttle blade isn't going to affect the way that the engine runs as far as gaskets go. If you tear up a gasket or something that's on the actual air cleaner side, the only thing you're risking is little dust and particulate getting into the engine. So you want to replace it, but it's not do or die. If you mess up a gasket after where this fuel and air comes together, you can let air slip in, and that will make the engine have what they call a vacuum leak, where the engine is sucking in a vacuum. If you are introducing the wrong amount of air into there, it's going to either make the engine not run at all, it won't idle, sometimes it'll be really sluggish. So when you start taking gaskets apart, anywhere from here to basically the head, the spark plug area, you risk running that kind of mistake, and you always want to replace the gaskets that are in there just to prevent that. So instead of taking that apart, we're going to take it off at the head and take these bolts out and see what kind of I'm thinking that this is a rubber type seal, which is going to be a lot easier to replace without having to go to the parts store and buy one. So just we're trying to get this engine to run without any type of issue before we really know what we're in for. So we take this off, and you can see indeed it does have just a rubber sealing ring in there. So that's good. That's meant to be reusable. You know, if you have a carburetor rebuild kit or something that you've ordered for this engine, you obviously don't have to reuse it. You have the luxury of putting it all back together new. But 99% out of the times, this is going to go back together and not affect how the engine runs. So speaking of carburetor kits or parts, on this particular engine, and I think most of the Briggs and Strattons of this, era, on the valve cover itself, OHV, overhead valve cover, it has your engine model number, family number, serial number, and all that stamped in. So sometimes it's in the valve cover. In the older engines, I know it was stamped into like the tin somewhere, the shrouding. You can find it in there. You just have to keep your eyes peeled and look for stamp numbers somewhere in the engine. Don't just go down to the parts store and say, yeah, I have a Briggs & Stratton 18.5 OHV, because the parts guy's not going to know what you're talking about. He's not going to be able to help you. He needs to actually type in the model number and stuff to get the right parts, because for how many thousands and thousands of engines that Briggs & Stratton has put out over the years, they've made a lot of different 18 horsepower engines, and these parts are not going to be all the same. So you have to get that info, go on, some type of website on your own if you want to pull up a parts breakdown. You can see all the parts that make this up and pick out exactly what you're looking for. So we'll go ahead and take these linkage arms off. We're going to try and take them off at the carburetor. Now that we have this carburetor loose, you can see like this one here is a hook. We'll be able to kind of wiggle this around and negotiate that off. This spring, we'll be able to just pull that off. Same with this rod here. We can take those off and just, you know, take a picture, take a video, something like that, or where they go. Sometimes these have different holes in them, so that's going to affect the RPM of the engine, how quickly the blade operates and opens. You want to just make sure you put it back where it came from stock. That way everything works the way it's supposed to, because when you open that throttle arm, it's almost timed so that it's going to give you the right engine speed at the right time with that throttle arm mechanism, so that way it'll run correctly. So we'll take this off and then we'll go and get it on the bench and start cleaning it up.